In this lesson, I will introduce what advertising is, and I will also take you through the different forms of advertising that we see today. But before we get there, let's cover what we'll do in this course. I want to encourage you to create a project that is similar in theory to the one that I will present to you. The aim of my project is to create a launch concept for a brand new whiskey variant for J&B whiskey. But for your project, it could be something entirely different. My hope is that with your final project, you think about who your audience is and how to engage with them beyond usual media. So it doesn't need to be traditional television, radio, print, etc. It can be, but maybe think beyond that. Think of different ways to tangibly engage with your audience. I also want you to think of who your audience is and how to diversify it. The creative challenge that I had with this project was, how do you market a brand new whiskey to non-whiskey drinkers? Remember, whiskey is a very members-only thing. It tends to be very masculine, more mature, men toasting their success. For this, we want to attract new people. We want to grow the segment a bit. So think of a similar way to take something that is normally known or marketed to a very small part of society and how to grow that, how to market it to someone else so that you make it more inclusive and more diverse. Today's world and today's consumer is always evolving and always changing, and we are identifying more and more segments of the population to include them in our messaging and our advertising. One of the important aspects of this course is to get you to think of more different kinds of target audiences and how your message can appeal to them. So now that I've given you the basics of what we'll cover in this course, let's talk about advertising. Let's introduce it. Let's go through the different forms. And for that, I've prepared a document. So let's take a look at the different forms of advertising we see today. Before we begin, it's important to note that there's a difference between advertising form and advertising medium. What we mean by advertising form is basically these four things that we see on screen: retail advertising, informational advertising, native advertising, and conceptual advertising. When you're talking about advertising medium, you're talking about billboard ads, print ads, digital banners. All of those things can form part or be employed in any one of these different forms of advertisings. Those advertising mediums can be employed in any of these advertising forms. So let's begin with retail advertising. As you can see on the left, here's an example of a retail advertisement. You can see that the price point is very prominent. It's very, very sales driven and very, very single-minded. Retail advertising is employed by companies who deal with FMCGs, fast-moving consumer goods, so they have to move a lot of product very fast, which is why they shout price. This is also a very effective form of advertising and is also very single-minded. Next, we get informational advertising, or infomercials as you may know it. Here we can see that informational advertising, it covers a lot of the features of a product and relies heavily on testimony. You'll normally see two people on a screen. They're talking about the product, they're using it, the presenter is talking to a regular person, and they're going through how amazing the features of the product is. The thing about informational advertising is that they don't really form an emotional connection between brand and consumer. It's mostly just informational driven. Next, we get native advertising, which employs an advertorial style. Advertorial is a word made up between advert and editorial, meaning it's basically an article in an advertising form, which means that it's an advert in an article form. Native advertising uses ads in its natural environment so that they don't appear like ads. So as you can see with an example on the left, Miracle Grow is advertising its services or its product in the natural setting of an article about gardening. So this makes it feel like it belongs here, like it's part of the content, but it's still advertising a service. So what is conceptual advertising? Conceptual advertising involves a big idea. You focus on a core benefit of what you're selling and a key insight of your target audience. Then you use that to develop a narrative or a story around that and establish an emotional connection between consumer and brand. With that being said, it is possible for conceptual advertising to appear in any one of these different forms of advertising. Let's go back quickly to retail advertising. As you can see, they're trying to use the idea of the winter blues as the concept. When the temperature gets low, our prices get even lower. Beat the winter blues. Here's an example of a retail campaign that is kind of trying to use a concept. We will unpack more about conceptual advertising later in the course, but I hope that this has given you a brief and concise explanation of the different forms of advertising. So now that we've gone through different forms of advertising, remember, every single advertising challenge starts with one thing, and that's a very, very important thing, the creative brief. I will take you through what a brief is, what it normally consists of, and how to work with it. It's very, very important to always be inquisitive and curious when you are presented with a brief. And another important lesson to remember is that not all briefs are the same, meaning that some briefs lacks a bit of information, some briefs have information that's maybe not that relevant, and some briefs are just poorly written. So we're going to go through what constitutes a good creative brief. We'll go through the various questions that it normally consists of, what those questions actually mean, and what questions you should be asking to gather as much information as you possibly can to equip you properly before you are set on your creative journey. So what is a creative brief? A creative brief really is the marketing communication problem that your client has, which you need to help them solve. It normally constitutes all the different aspects of the brand, the product, the challenges that the product is facing, and who the target audience is, so who they're trying to market towards. It should also have a good background to know what your client has done before, what the target audience has been exposed to before, and how to kind of cut through the clutter of a very convoluted and a very filled up space within that segment. It also should provide you with a very, very good starting platform so that you have everything you need in your brain to create the best work that you possibly can. In order to get there, you need to interrogate the brief, you need to ask the right questions, and remember that it's your job to ask as many questions as you possibly can and to know and equip yourself with all the knowledge you possibly can in order to do your best work. It's very, very, very important to always stick to the brief. That is the job that your client is paying you to do. So we don't want to venture too far away from what their problem is. But that being said, it's good to stick to the brief, but it's also good to come up with ideas around that perhaps the brief didn't ask for. Sometimes what I'll also take you through is a word called proactive. That is proactive advertising thinking, coming up with ideas on your own, where there was no brief, where there was no problem that you were presented with, but that is still relevant and that could still work for your client or your product. It's very, very important to stick to the brief so that your client gets their money's worth, but it's also a good idea to give them more than what they paid for. So now let me take you through an example of a brief template. I have sourced a brief template from a friend of mine who works in the industry. So this is a real actual brief template that you will be exposed to should you be working in advertising. These are all the various questions that you are likely to see. It contains things like KPIs, key performance index. It contains things like target audience. It contains things like, how many units they're expecting to sell, if that's the creative problem that you need to solve. It will contain a lot of different and a lot of new words that you might haven't learned yet before. I will explain what they mean and how to interpret them. You will see a lot of abbreviations and new words that you may not have heard before or understand what they mean. Not to worry, I will explain what those mean and how to interpret them. So here we have a typical example of a creative brief template. These are the usual questions that you will see written on the brief. We will go through each of these, and then later on I will type in descriptors next to each one so you can understand what exactly is being asked. So let's begin. Who is the client? What is the product? Then it asks for the single-minded message, the project due date, strategy, brief summary overview, context and background, objectives, what is the positioning, KPIs, target audience, what is the CTA, project requirements, list of deliverables and format, with sizes and quantity, and finally, what is the budget for this campaign? Now let's go ahead and write in some descriptors. So, who is the client? What is the product? This is basically asking what are we selling? Single-minded message. Imagine that this brief was a tweet. How would you write it in one sentence? The short version of it. The project due date, when is the artwork or the presentation needed? What is the time plan? Strategy. Has a strategy been done before? And if so, it needs to be attached to this brief. Brief summary overview. This is the overall brief details, and it usually consists of what the client has asked us to do. Context and background. Why are we doing this campaign? Has there been a campaign that was done previously? Objectives. This should be self-explanatory. What do we hope to achieve with this campaign? What is the positioning? How do we position this product or service within the market? Then KPIs. KPI stands for Key Performance Index. This is how the success of the campaign will be measured. Our target audience is basically the people that we're marketing this campaign towards. Who are we talking to? What do I need to know about them? Do we have any insights on this target audience? What is the CTA? The CTA stands for Call to Action. What are we asking people to do? Project requirements usually means, are there any specific requirements to consider in order to execute the work? Then, list of deliverables and format. Are we doing a TV ad, radio, print? What is the medium we're working with? Then finally, budget. What is the amount of money we have in order to produce the work? Once we start interrogating the brief and asking more questions, we will add more to this brief. I will explain the questions you should be asking and what they mean. So now that I've taken you through what a brief template looks like, in the next lesson, I will go through what you need in order to get started on your creative journey and equipping yourself with the right tools in order to map out and explore your creative process.